Sometimes a woman doesn't wake up because of a thunderclap, but because of a silence that suddenly sounds wrong. It arrives on an ordinary afternoon in the car, after work in the supermarket line in the middle of washing dishes. A sentence floats up from nowhere: "I can't do this anymore." And it doesn't sound dramatic. It sounds factual, like the way you might notice the light is on or it's starting to rain. In Jungian language, we would call this a message from the unconscious, wrapped in the modest clothing of an everyday thought. Sometimes it even arranges itself as synchronicity. A book you happen to pick up, a podcast, you accidentally click this video arriving in your feed at the exact moment your inner life is quietly rearranging itself behind your back. From the outside, nothing has changed yet. You still show up, you still answer texts, you know which smile to wear with which person. The persona, the carefully shaped social self that Jung described as the mask we develop to meet the expectations of the world, remains intact. It still knows how to laugh at the right time, how to soften its voice, how to offer a reassuring word, even when your own interior feels like an abandoned house. For years, perhaps for decades, this arrangement seemed to work. You were praised for being understanding, for being so strong, for always explaining yourself so others could stay comfortable. The performance was rewarded, which made it easy to mistake exhaustion for love. But something has been shifting underneath. It begins as a very specific kind of tiredness, not the fatigue that sleep cures, but a strange, weightless heaviness that sits behind your eyes and in your chest. You may notice it after yet another conversation where you explain in painstaking detail why you feel what you feel, hoping the other person will finally understand. You may notice it when you find yourself typing a long message justifying a simple boundary, and your body whispers very quietly, "No more." Jung spoke of the self as the organizing center of the psyche, deeper than the ego, deeper than the persona. When the self wants to move, it does not negotiate. It begins to withdraw energy from old forms of life. Powers you once used for endless explanations suddenly fail to appear. At first, this withdrawal looks like nothing. A sentence left unsent, a justification you almost give and then simply don't. You catch yourself in the doorway of an old habit and without fanfare, choose not to walk through. That is how individuation, the process by which a person becomes more fully themselves, often begins. Not with a blaze of rebellion, but with small refusals that feel almost too quiet to matter. Yet these refusals are tectonic. Each time you do not translate your inner world for someone who has no intention of really listening, energy that once flowed outward falls back into your own depths. The soul, which has long been offering its lifeblood to keep fragile bridges alive, begins to drink itself back. For many women, this moment is accompanied by confusion. There is a subtle guilt, as if you are breaking an invisible law. Since girlhood, you were trained in a particular pattern. To explain yourself is to be good. To be transparent is to be kind. To be endlessly available is to be loving. You learned early that your presence needed a reason. If you laughed too loudly, you scanned faces to see whether you needed to apologize. If you felt sad, you found rational words for it, so no one would be disturbed by its rawness. Over time, you became a commentator on your own existence, adding footnotes to every feeling so that others would not misread you. This pattern, so common it is almost invisible, is not just personal. It is archetypal. It belongs to the collective field of the feminine in our culture, the archetype of the translator, the one who makes herself understandable so she may be allowed to stay. And when a woman begins to loosen this archetype, the collective trembles a little. People around her sense that something is different. They may say she has become distant, closed, not like she used to be. They do not see that what is fading is not her heart, but the compensatory performance that kept everyone else comfortable at her expense. From the inside, this change feels like entering a liminal corridor. You are no longer willing to perform the old role, but you do not yet know who you are without it. The persona has cracked, revealing a silence beneath it that is not empty but unoccupied, like a room in your own house you somehow never entered. This is the threshold. The life you built through justification, rescuing, and seeking recognition begins to loosen its grip, not because you have declared a grand revolution, but because your soul has quietly stopped funding what no longer serves it. When the persona begins to loosen, the psyche enters a liminal dusk, a kind of inner twilight where old patterns no longer feel inhabitable, but the new ones have not yet taken shape. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment the unconscious steps forward with greater authority, drawing the woman inward toward a deeper center she has not yet learned to trust. It is not a collapse, it is a calling. And yet it feels at first like being unmoored, like waking up in a life whose architecture you built with such care, only to realize the walls no longer recognize you. This is when the second pattern, emotional rescuing, begins to dissolve, often through a kind of subterranean fatigue that no longer permits the old overextensions. Women who carry this pattern frequently describe a sudden inability to absorb the emotional chaos of others. It is not that they don't care. It is that something ancient within them refuses. Jung wrote that the psyche contains an instinct for self-preservation, a biological and spiritual imperative that asserts itself when the ego's behaviors threaten the organism. Emotional rescuing is one such threat, though it rarely appears dangerous on the surface. To the outside world, it looks like compassion, devotion, maturity. For the woman living it, it feels like a lifelong contract signed before she knew how to read. In many families, this contract is forged early. A child becomes the steady one, the listener, the adjuster of moods, the quiet emotional sponge who absorbs the household's unspoken tensions. She grows up believing that love is synonymous with carrying what is unbearable for others. She grows up believing that if she does not soften the room, no one will survive the sharpness. Jung might say she becomes the container for the family's shadow, the repository for feelings too dangerous for others to touch. She becomes both the vessel and the scapegoat for a collective unconscious that was never hers to manage. By adulthood, this pattern feels like an identity. She is the one who understands, the friend you can always call, the daughter who never asks for anything, the partner who forgives. But beneath these compliments lies a profound misrecognition. They are praising her self-abandonment, not her soul. And the psyche knows. It grows restless inside the mask. A woman may find herself irritated at people she once willingly held. She may notice a tension in her jaw when someone begins to unload their emotional debris. She may feel her stomach tightening, her breath shortening, her mind drifting. These bodily sensations are not signs of coldness, they are signs of awakening. Somatic wisdom always precedes conscious insight. The body refuses first, the mind catches up later. Soon, situations that once felt normal begin to feel intrusive, even invasive. The friend who calls only to vent suddenly feels impossible to tolerate. The family member whose crises dominate every gathering seems to drain the air from the room. The partner who leans on her emotional labor without doing their own soul work appears not vulnerable, but dependent. And when she finally steps back or even hesitates, guilt rises like a tidal wave. This guilt is not hers. It is the echo of centuries in which women were taught that their worth rested in their ability to absorb the emotional weight of others. Jung would say this guilt belongs to the collective mother archetype in its distorted form, a shadowed version of nurturing where giving becomes a slow form of self-erasure. In the liminal space, this guilt must be confronted. The woman learns to distinguish between compassion and compulsion, between loving someone and rescuing them from their own necessary descent. True compassion has boundaries. False compassion has none. False compassion feeds on her life force not out of love, but out of fear, fear that without her others will fall apart and she will be blamed for their collapse. This fear is the child's fear, not the woman's. It belongs to the era before she had power. As she steps back, the world around her shifts. Some people grow angry, accusing her of selfishness. Others become confused, wondering why she has changed. In truth, she has not changed. She has simply stopped participating in the dynamics that kept them comfortable. She has stopped being their mirror, their mother, their emotional crutch. She has stepped out of the archetypal role they projected onto her. And in doing so, she enters the underworld of her own psyche, the descent that every mythic woman must make. This descent is not an abandonment of others, it is a return to the self. In Jungian terms, the self begins reabsorbing the psychic energy she once poured into maintaining relational illusions. This reclamation feels like loneliness at first. But loneliness is not isolation. It is an emptying out a sacred clearing. And in that clearing, the woman begins to hear the faint echo of her own voice. There is a moment in every woman's descent when the landscape around her grows strangely still. The outer world continues, conversations, obligations, the rhythmic machinery of ordinary life. But she feels herself moving beneath it, as though walking along a riverbed while everyone else skims the surface above. This sensation is the entrance into what Jung called the underworld of the unconscious, the psychic realm, where forgotten truths, abandoned instincts, and unclaimed shadows gather like exiles waiting to be named. No one descends here willingly. The descent is summoned, not chosen. It begins the moment she stops rescuing, stops explaining, stops performing, and the psyche, freed from its outward compulsions, turns her attention inward with a force she can no longer ignore. Here in this subterranean world, she meets the part of herself she's been taught to fear, the shadow. Jung described the shadow as the repository of everything the ego rejects: anger, ambition, desire, intuition, erotic vitality, even the simple need to rest. For women raised under the expectation of emotional service, the shadow is often full of the qualities she was punished or shamed for showing. The girl who was told she was too emotional hides her authentic sorrow. The one labeled bossy hides her leadership. The girl who learned that her joy was too much hides her exuberance. And perhaps most dangerous of all, the one taught to be agreeable hides her anger, the sacred fire that would have protected her. When a spiritually awakening woman encounters her shadow, it rarely appears as abstract theory. It emerges through feeling. It comes as irritability toward people she once tolerated with ease, sudden flashes of anger that seem out of character, an unexplainable grief that leaks through her composure, or a fierce longing for a life she cannot yet name. The ego panics at these eruptions, trying to push them back into the old containers. But the unconscious does not negotiate. Once the descent begins, the walls crumble. This confrontation with the shadow is often accompanied by dream symbolic messages from the deep psyche. A woman may dream of unfamiliar rooms inside her childhood home, or of wild animals staring at her with unsettling recognition. She may dream of water rising or of wandering hallways that seem endless. Jung would say such dreams are not random, they are maps. They show her what she has silenced, where she has abandoned herself, and the instincts waiting to return. But the shadow is only one layer of the underworld. Beneath it lies the ancestral field, the collective unconscious, the deep reservoir of human experience that Jung described as the psyche's common inheritance. For many women, descending into their own unconscious brings them into contact with the emotional residues of those who came before them. They begin to sense patterns that are older than their personal story. The grandmother who endured silently, the mother who carried the emotional burdens of everyone around her, the lineage of women who learned that their value lay in softness, compliance, service. These patterns live in the body like old weather. They shape instinct, expectation, even posture. The woman awakening now is not only confronting her personal wounds, she is confronting the psychic memory of the feminine lineage that trained her to disappear. This ancestral encounter often presents itself through sudden clarity realizations that feel too large to be personal insights that arrive with the certainty of fate. She may understand in an instant that the guilt she carries was never hers. She may see that the exhaustion she interprets as personal failure is actually the accumulated fatigue of generations who were denied rest. She may begin to weep without knowing why, her tears belonging not only to her own life, but to the lives of women who were never allowed to feel theirs. This is not emotional collapse, it is the psyche clearing space for a new inheritance. And then, almost inevitably, she must face the father complex, the internalized structure of masculine recognition and approval she once depended on to feel real. Jung used the term complex to describe emotionally charged patterns that operate autonomously within the psyche. The father complex is particularly potent for women, the longing to be seen by the masculine, acknowledged by it, validated by it. It is not about the literal father alone, but about teachers, partners, bosses, mentors, society itself, any figure or system that embodies authority and recognition. For much of her life, a woman may shape herself to win this gaze, mistaking its approval for her own worth. But in the underworld, this illusion dissolves. She begins to recognize that the validation she sought was unstable because it was external. She may feel a grief so sharp it nearly bends her in half, the grief of realizing she has spent years, perhaps decades, contorting herself for a form of love that could never complete her. And yet this grief is a threshold. For the first time, she glimpses what Jung called the inner masculine, the animus, not as a harsh critic or gatekeeper, but as a potential ally, an inner voice of clarity, logic, direction, and sovereignty that belongs entirely to her. To reach it, she must release the external father imago. This release feels like a death, but it is necessary. Only when she stops performing for the outer masculine can she hear the quiet authority of the inner one. Only then can she begin to build a life not shaped by approval, but guided by truth. As the father complex loosens its hold, a great internal silence follows, one not of emptiness, but of a vast and unfamiliar spaciousness. For the first time, the woman senses the possibility of a life not oriented around external recognition. Jung often emphasized that the ego, once freed from its compulsive attachments, becomes capable of perceiving the movements of the deeper psyche. In this silence, she begins to hear something that was always present, but drowned beneath the noise of explanation rescuing and the pursuit of approval. It is the faint pulse of her own eros. Eros in Jungian psychology is not simply sexual energy, but the connective principle of life itself, the psychic force that binds, creates, relates, and animates. For many women, Eros was redirected from the beginning toward caretaking, pleasing, smoothing the edges of others. It flowed outward in service of relationships that drained rather than nourished. Now, with those channels closed, Eros has nowhere to go but back into the woman herself. At first, this return feels disorienting. She may experience bursts of creativity, sudden desires, unusual dreams, or an ache for meaning that is both exhilarating and terrifying. She may feel restless in her own skin, as though something inside her is trying to unfurl. This is the moment when the old ego identity begins to dissolve. Without the familiar patterns that once structured her days, explaining, rescuing, seeking recognition, the psyche reorganizes itself. She may feel like she is losing her sense of self because, in truth, she is. The good girl, the pleaser, the caretaker, the emotional anchor, the ever-available one, these identities begin to wither as the woman's life force withdraws from them. Jung called this process the death of the persona. It is not literal death, but symbolic death, the collapse of the mask she once believed was her face. But death in the psyche is always followed by rebirth. In the void created by her refusals, the self emerges, the deep organizing center of the psyche that holds the blueprint of her true nature. The self does not shout, it does not demand, it does not ask to be explained. It guides through resonance, through intuition, through a quiet certainty that feels like remembering something she has never consciously known. Decisions that once required endless deliberation suddenly become obvious. Boundaries that once felt impossible become non-negotiable. She begins to feel what Jung called a vocation of the soul, a sense that her life has a shape, a direction, a meaning that originates from within rather than from the demands of others. Yet this emergence is not without pain. When a woman stops orienting her life around external validation, she inevitably enters a phase of psychological loneliness. Not isolation, loneliness. It is the altitude of consciousness, the thin air of a higher psychological elevation. The relationships formed from her old patterns begin to fall away, not through conflict, but through lack of resonance. Friends who depended on her rescuing drift to others. Family members accustomed to her emotional labor become uncomfortable with her new clarity. Old partners may accuse her of becoming cold, distant, selfish. They are not seeing her. They are seeing the loss of the function she once provided. In this psychological solitude, a woman meets herself without witnesses. It is here that the inner masculine, the animus, begins its transformation. Once a figure of internal criticism or externalized authority, the animus becomes her ally, offering discernment, clarity, and direction. She discovers she can think with authority. She can choose with conviction. She can anchor herself in her own truth without needing the world to approve. At the same time, her inner feminine, the eros-filled, intuitive, embodied aspect of her psyche begins to bloom. She notices subtle shifts, a deeper breath, a slower pace, a more grounded presence. She begins to feel connected to her instincts, her longings, her body's signals. For the first time, she senses what it means to live from her center, not from adaptation. She realizes she does not need to justify her no or perform her yes. Her being becomes sufficient. This stage of awakening often brings an unexpected clarity about the past. She sees the role she played not with resentment, but with compassion, understanding that she adapted to survive. She sees the ways she betrayed herself without blame, and she sees with startling precision what must be released next. The self once awakened does not allow regression. It pulls her forward, sometimes gently, sometimes with a fierce demand that feels like destiny. In this stage, her perception refines. She becomes exquisitely sensitive to energetic dynamics, who drains her, who nourishes her, who meets her at depth, who only seeks her function. It is not judgment, it is discernment. The woman who once rescued now witnesses. The woman who once explained now observes. The woman who once sought recognition now recognizes herself. What she is approaching, though she may not yet name it, is sovereignty, the internal alignment of ego with self. And that alignment marks the beginning of a new life, one in which her very presence becomes an instrument of transformation. As sovereignty takes root, the woman begins to sense that her life is no longer moving horizontally toward approval, acceptance, belonging, but vertically toward depth. This shift is subtle at first, like discovering a hidden current beneath the surface of a familiar river. Her decisions begin to arise from an inner authority that feels older than her personality, older than her memories, older even than the particular life she has lived. Jung often referred to this as the voice of the self, the transpersonal center of the psyche that orients us toward wholeness. When the ego aligns with this deeper center, action becomes quieter, but more precise, like a blade sharpened not for violence, but for clarity. Now, when she speaks, the words come from the body, not the mind. When she rests all the way down to the bone. When she walks away, she does so without bitterness, because the departure is not a reaction, it is a movement of truth. This is the strange paradox of individuation. As the woman becomes more fully herself, she becomes less willing to force herself into spaces where her soul cannot breathe. She is no longer available for relationships built upon her exhaustion. She is no longer willing to be the emotional scaffold for others' unexamined pain. And she no longer feels compelled to justify the quiet, instinctive movements of her being. People around her may interpret this as aloofness, but inwardly, she is becoming more intimate with life than ever before. Her attention sharpens. She senses the subtle shifts of her own psyche, as if listening to weather patterns inside her chest. She recognizes when she is betraying herself within seconds, not years. And she no longer confuses guilt with guidance. Guilt becomes a signal that she is leaving the old collective conditioning. Truth becomes the grounding sensation that she is entering her own authority. This is also the phase in which many women report a new relationship with synchronicity, the meaningful coincidences that Jung believed emerge when the unconscious and conscious mind move into alignment. The right book arrives, the right sentence appears, the right opportunity unfolds the moment she stops asking for permission to exist. Synchronicities become like breadcrumbs, leading her deeper into the forest of her own becoming. They reveal an intelligence in the psyche that is not personal, but archetypal, a guiding force that seems to say, you are no longer wandering, you are being led. At the same time, her relationship to solitude transforms. The loneliness that once felt like exile now feels like sanctuary. She realizes she can sit with herself without dissolving. She can feel her own emotions without translating them for an audience. She can experience pleasure, grief, intuition, and vision without explaining them to anyone. This inner companionship marks the healing of the child within the one who once believed she needed to rescue others to be worthy of love, the one who once believed she needed to soften herself to be allowed to stay. Now the child rests, and when the child rests, the woman rises. With this rising comes a new form of perception, what depth psychology might call symbolic vision. She sees the world through archetypal eyes. The arguments in her family are no longer personal failures. They are reenactments of ancestral patterns seeking resolution. The relationships that fall away do not signify loss, but the closing of karmic loops. The new connections that arrive carry a resonance that feels like recognition from another lifetime. Life becomes less a battlefield and more an unfolding myth, one in which she is both protagonist and witness actor, and observer, the one who journeys and the one who interprets the journey. And then, almost without noticing, she begins to teach not through advice but through presence. Other women feel something in her, something unspoken but unmistakable. They see the way she holds herself, the way she says no without apology, the way she listens without rescuing, the way she exists without permission. Her sovereignty activates something dormant in them. Her wholeness becomes an invitation. The generations behind her feel it too. Daughters born or unborn receive the silent transmission. You may exist without justification. You may love without self-erasure. You may walk away without guilt. You may take up space without apology. This is how lineage heals, not through dramatic declarations, but through quiet revolutions in the psyche of one woman who chooses to belong to herself. At the far horizon of this journey lies homecoming, the return to the self. This homecoming feels like standing in the center of a vast inner temple, one she has been building stone by stone each time she said no to what diminished her, and yes to what aligned with truth. She realizes that nothing she released was ever truly hers. The only things that remain are the ones that resonate with her essence. The relationships that stay deepen. The work that stays stabilizes. The life that stays becomes an expression of her inner alignment. And in this place, she discovers a final revelation, the quiet masterpiece of Jungian individuation. The soul does not blossom by striving. It blossoms when we finally stop abandoning it. If these words have touched a place you recognize, if you feel the stirrings of your own descent, your own awakening, your own quiet revolution, I invite you to stay on this journey with me. Like, share, or comment if you feel called, and subscribe if you want to continue exploring the deep psychological and spiritual dimensions of feminine consciousness and Jungian transformation.